absolutely windless day here in Durban, South Africa. Slightly humid, so we're all in shorts. It's nice and warm, but there is not a breath of wind. No leaves are moving. It doesn't happen very often here, but anyway, spectacular day here. Right, welcome. We're on series of trying to experience Exodus through ancient eyes. It means that we're reading Exodus again, not from a dogmatic point of view. In other words, to try and figure out all the beliefs we should have, but much more from a historical point of view. How would people in the ancient world have understood this book if it was read to them? That's kind of what we're after. And for that, we need to have a closer look at the actual text and what is in there. We need to read a little bit more nuanced than what we used to as Christians by just reading over the uncomfortable things and just ignoring them. We need to spend time on them to see what they mean, or to try and figure that out as far as possible. Now, we are in episode 6, I think, today. And today we are getting close to the actual action, right? All of this is pre-fight. It's that which leads up to this massive clash between God, and as we'll see today, hopefully, God and the gods of the Egyptians, right? The major theme here that we need to pick up on, which is really hard for, I think, modern Christians to pick up on, and we'll be speaking a little bit about that today, is that this is not just the Egyptians against the Israelites. This is not just Moses against Pharaoh. And this is also not just God against Pharaoh and the Egyptians. But in truth, this is really Moses' God, Yahweh, against the gods of the Egyptians. And this is a cosmic clash, a fight between the gods, really, that's going on here. And I'll show you why that seems to be a consensus among scholars who spend their life investigating these type of things, and the book of Exodus particularly. And one of the main reasons why we today find this so hard to believe is, for some reason, Christians believe that the ancient Israelites were monotheists. And so it doesn't make any sense to say that they believed that there were other gods, or that they would write a piece of ancient literature where God seems to be opposing other gods. It wouldn't make any sense, because there is no other God. Well, that's exactly the thing we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid putting a modern perspective onto an ancient document, and getting back into the ancient time as much as we possibly can by reading extensively around the ancient times, or from that period, and trying to figure out what were they really thinking at that time. And it just so turns out that ancient Israelites did not think like Christians. They didn't even think like the first century Jews. They thought rather differently. We'll be getting into some of that today. So where are we in the story? Well, we're at the place where Moses has traveled all the way out of Egypt. He's gone across the Sinai Peninsula, into the land of Midian. Now, Midian sits on the eastern side of that second gulf on the eastern side of the Sinai Peninsula. There he met up with Jethro, one of the names that's given for his father-in-law, and he marries a beautiful Zipporah. And then God meets him at Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, and there he kind of reveals himself to Moses, and Moses gets this instruction: you need to go back. You need to go save and deliver the Israelites. You need to be my proxy. You need to be my representative. And that's kind of where we are. So Moses is on his way back. Last week we spoke about this really strange little encounter where God suddenly attacks, it seems like, Moses' son, until Zipporah circumcises him. We spoke about that last time. We're not going to do that today. Now, okay, so Moses is on his way back, right? We find then that Aaron sneaks out of Egypt. Like he escapes the slavery, right? I guess it's hard to escape if you're a slave, but he managed. And he comes all the way to the mountain of God. Now, when it comes to the mountain of God, there's something we need to take a note of. Now, I don't think it's a minor issue. I used to think it's a minor issue. Now I realize it's actually part of understanding what's going on here. There are two mountains of God. There's the one that we traditionally allocate in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. But then there's also a mountain on the eastern side of the second Gulf, or the eastern Gulf of the Sinai Peninsula. This seems to be the Mount Sinai that Paul refers to in his New Testament writings. But it seems like in this book we have two names. We have Horeb and Mount Sinai, so that's strange at first. But we also like it. Some of it doesn't make sense. Like, for instance, if the mountain of God was located at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, Moses encountered this mountain while walking or taking out the sheep of Jethro for pasturing. Now, this is, guys, this is almost like 300 kilometers. That's not how people pasture sheep. And so it just seems like there's a bit of a disparity between where this mountain actually was. Some of the stories doesn't make sense if it is in the Sinai Peninsula. Some of the stories don't make sense if the mountain of God is Mount Sinai in Arabia, which is on the eastern side of the Gulf. And the most logical conclusion is that we've got two traditions coming at us, and they've been edited together by the editors, as we've mentioned so many times. And we've had many examples of this, and we will still have many examples of this. And it's in the abundance of evidence for multiple tradition that most of scholarship accepts. There's multiple traditions speaking to us here. And if you're tuning in for the first time, this is one of the reasons why scholars don't be one of them. There are many, there are many very strong reasons. But this is one of the reasons why scholars don't believe that Moses actually wrote this, because there's contradicting stories. There's multiple traditions that come together, and that doesn't seem plausible. That someone who's writing from first-hand experience is going to give us 3-4 names for the name of Jethro, 2 names for the mountain of God, and seems to locate this mountain in 2 different places. It doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so Aaron manages to get out of Egypt, and he comes all the way across to the mountain of God. I'm not going to keep on trying to specify which one of these mountains they are. You can, if you reflect back on this, you can kind of work it out for yourself which one is implied by the story. But Moses then has the opportunity to tell Aaron everything that happened at this burning bush experience on the mountain of God, right? The scene then cuts back to the elders in Egypt. Now, this is about 400, just give you an idea, from Midian all the way across into Goshen, which is probably the place where the Israelites were in Egypt. It's about 400 kilometers. Now, it's about a 10-day walk. So, there's some time that's passed you, obviously, so just to be aware of it, right? So, Aaron goes and him and Moses talk to the elders, because first they have to convince the elders, and so they speak to the elders, and the elders are on board. They're excited, like, the God of our fathers has come to rescue us. Moses probably showed them some signs, and so they're all on board. They're going to tell Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's going to let them go. So we have then next the first audience with Pharaoh, long awaited, but this is in Exodus 5 verse 1. And they go to Pharaoh and they demand, and this is how their demand is worded, that Pharaoh should let them go because they would like to celebrate a festival in the wilderness all the way at Mount Sinai. Now, once again, we don't know which one he's talking about, but here the point is Mount Sinai is quite far away from Goshen, probably between 300 and 400 kilometers, the closest one, which is almost a 10-day journey already. But anyway, just to jump forward a little bit, when they eventually get there, of course, they create a golden calf and basically start a new religion, it seems, at first reading, or a little bit more about that later. But obviously the meeting doesn't go the way the elders would have liked it, although Moses probably knew it wasn't going to go too well. Pharaoh is an established ruler. To some ways, he is worshipped as a god. The gods that he served, they're thousands of years old. The pyramids are built. This is a dynasty. This is huge. Their success as a civilization, they ascribe to the power of their gods. And now there's a slave man who comes and says, we have a God. His name is YHWH, and he says, you must let us go. This is not going to work well in the ancient world, because the people in power, autocratic power, they are not going to let their subjugates go. It didn't work that way. And so obviously Pharaoh says, no, sovereigns do not yield to the demands of powerless people. That's just not how the ancient world worked. But Moses and Aaron, they repeat the demand. In this time, they put it like this. They say, let us go on a 3-day journey to go and sacrifice. All right, so 3-day journey. All right, you can make the count yourself. That they've got to be walking. They've got to be really, really moving to get to even the closest Sinai in 3 days. But anyway, but Moses adds something interesting. Either Moses or Aaron adds something very interesting here. He adds to this that Yahweh will fall on us with pestilence and sword if you don't let us go. Now, this is strange for two reasons. Number one, there's no indication that earlier God told Moses that if you don't get out, I will kill you. That's not there. Okay, so that's a little bit strange. But the second thing that's quite strange is how is that motivation for Pharaoh? I mean, possibly not stretch of the imagination, but at a stretch, it would mean that Pharaoh will lose his workforce. But he's not going to die. He's not going to get pestilence or sword. They are. So it's just not convincing enough for Pharaoh. And of course, to no surprise, Pharaoh again says, sorry. And then what Pharaoh does after this first meeting is he tells his taskmasters to be more brutal with the Israelites. Typical tyrant tactic. The people now feel the brunt of the audacity of Moses and Aaron, and they start complaining. We are being worked harder. That gets to the elders. The elders are upset with Moses and Aaron, right? So things don't go so well between Israel or the elders of Israel, and they're a little bit on edge, and they start to blame Moses for the mess. Moses starts whining back at God, like, why have you mistreated this people? Did you even ever send me? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's mistreated this people, and you have done nothing to deliver your people. So Moses goes back and he kind of moans at God in chapter 5, verse 22. But here's a very important part of the story. God replies to the moaning and the whining of Moses. It's a very telling part of the book of Exodus, and I'm going to read it to you because it plays a vital role in understanding, for instance, why it took 10 plagues. For instance, why Pharaoh's hard heart needed to be hardened. So here it is, Exodus 6, verse 1. Now you shall see, God speaking to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by a mighty hand, he will let them go. By a mighty hand, he will drive them out of his land. In other words, it seems like the writer is indicating or implying that God knew, and he's got a plan. Don't worry, I knew this would happen. Now you will see me and my mighty hand, what I'm going to do for the Israelites, right? So God doesn't even rebuke Moses in this rebuttal. He doesn't. He just says, now you'll see, Moses, what I'm about to do. And here, the whole story is set into motion. Not failure for this mission, but it's part of be a lesson for Egypt and Israel. The wheel, things are about to go down. At first, the story is interrupted by a genealogy, which is really, really interesting. Genealogies would normally find their space early in books or at the beginning of a story, but also they sometimes find their place, and this seems to be the case here, at the introduction of a person and their lineage. So an important person is on the scene, and first we need to give you their credentials. We need to tell you who their parents were. We need to tell you who their children are or will be. And so here we have a very important figure, Aaron. Right. And why is Aaron an important figure to the writers? Because remember that the writers of this portion, they're writing from a 700 years later, in a place where the Levitical priesthood is already operating or has been operating. and or needs to be reinstated. And so it's important to the writers to emphasize in this story the historical importance and the historical credentials of the tribe of Levi, and why they need to be in charge of the priesthood, why they need to be in charge of temple operations. Okay, so let's move on. Exodus 6, verse 2. So, strangely enough, the entire section of Exodus 6, verse 2 to 7 and 13, or sorry, excuse me, let me say that again. Exodus 6, verse 2 to 7 and 13. It reads like a repeat of Exodus 3, verse 1 to Exodus 6, verse 1. In both these sections, we have God revealing his divine name to Moses, right? I'm not going to give you the scripture verses. You can go look for it yourself. It's in there. God announces that God heard Israel's cries, and he tells Moses what he needs to say to the Israelites. In both these sections, Moses complains that he's a poor speaker, and in both these sections, Aaron will be Moses' mouthpiece. Now, this is a repetition of quite a bit of information. And the question is, why is there such a repetition of all this information? Is it necessary? Is it just there for emphasis or importance? And of course, that could be the case. But it seems like we find a lot of this right throughout the scripture, and I mentioned a lot about this last week. I'm not going to do it again, but even in the New Testament, often a repetition of such large ideas is once again an indication we have two traditions that come together and they are placed together. And though it looks like a repetition, it's really two versions of the story that came down to the writer. And out of respect for both traditions, they are both included. One of the ways that we know often that this is it's not just a mere repetition, but a double tradition, is that the details of the two stories often differ, and often also even at the point of contradiction, where you have to do real mental gymnastics to make them say the same thing. So scholars obviously consider these sections to be a second version of Moses' call, Moses' commission. That's placed here by the editor. We look especially at chapter 6, verse 2, where the divine name, Yahweh, is reintroduced to Moses. You can really see the point if you go back to chapter 3, verse 1, and you read all the way through to 7, verse 14, and you skip this 7:2 to 7:13. And then if you read it all again and you include 7:2 to 7:13, the repetition of this portion really hits you. Now, I must confess that as I've been reading this portion on and off for the last, well, as a pastor, 20 years of my life, I always noticed the repetition, but never knew what to make of it. Like, it's there, and I'm like, why is this? Actually, now that I think back on it, I remember thinking, this is disjointed. Why is this being done twice? Why isn't there just a straight line? God giving him his command and, and telling him what he needs to do. Why do we have to keep on jumping back? I never had an answer for that. Now I kind of understand that a little bit better. Right, so the thing is that these are not just mere repetitions, but it of course is a clue that we're dealing with an alternate version of the story. For example, let's have a quick look. In chapters 3 to 4 is much longer, excuse me, and it doesn't really make clear whether whether no one has heard the name of God, or it's just Moses that hasn't heard it, right? But in chapter 6, it's made quite clear that actually this name has never been known. And even to Abram, God made himself known as El Shaddai, which is an interesting statement. Maybe something you've never thought about, but that God never revealed himself by the name Yahweh to anyone before Moses, at least according to one of these traditions that we've received. In other words, Abram did not know the name Yahweh, YHWY, or translated as Jehovah or Yahweh as we understand today. And it just seems that the editor is more concerned with preserving both these stories than he is with creating just a beautiful, smooth narrative like we would want it. But of course, at the same time, it's one of the things that tells us it's not written by a single author. So the point is, why would editors add these two together? Well, where else would you put the two stories? You've got to put them next to each other because they belong together. It's the same, they're giving a different version of the same event. So they kind of fit together. So often what you would find is two versions, according to me, from what I've seen. When there's two traditions about one event, they either get placed in a chronological order like this, or they get weaved together in ways. Like we find in the New Testament, a weaving in the final discourse of Jesus, John 13 to 17 or 18, that it's weaved together in some way. In other words, sometimes it's put inside like that or inside like that, or other times when you go to the two flood accounts, they more like weave together like this. The creation accounts are obviously put in chronological order, but the reality is, once you look a little bit deeper, once you become a little bit more serious about the Bible, this stuff is everywhere, right? When as a pastor for 20 years, I read for sermon material, so these things weren't important to me, and now I'm no longer reading for sermon material. Now I'm reading for what it says, and now these things I can't miss them anymore. They feel like they are everywhere. Okay, so now we get to the genealogy. Chapter 6, verse 14 contains the genealogy of Aaron. So, as I've mentioned previously, a very important reason why an editor is not, he's going, let me rephrase that. There has to be an important reason why an editor would interject a beautiful flowing story with a genealogy. It's to place emphasis on normally someone's position, someone's credentials, etc. Okay, so right. The writer interrupts the flow of the narrative on purpose. There's a list of names, and this list of names makes sure that we understand who Aaron and Moses is, and that we are reminded that they are both from the tribe of Levi, and therefore they are priests. Now, of course, in the storyline, there's no priesthood yet, but from the writer's perspective and the reader's perspective, the priesthood is already well established. In other words, this portion kind of, the function of it could be, or is at least to some degree, writing in the credentials of the Levitical priesthood under Aaron. Okay, so Moses is demoralized, and he needs a bit of a reminding of the call of God that sent him. And after failure with Pharaoh and the elders, round one, right, God is asking him to march straight back in, right, back into the court and go and do the same thing. Einstein's version of doing the same thing, or Einstein's little saying, doing the same thing, and the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and hoping the outcome would be different. Fortunately, Moses didn't know Einstein. But Moses is obviously not happy. And this brings us to the end of the section. Now here in 13, we get the inclusion verse 13 of chapter 6. We get the inclusion of Aaron. Aaron is included in the story. And why is he brought in? Well, it helps us to transition into what follows next. Oh, Bella's making an appearance on the screen today. What follows next is the genealogy. The genealogy in which Aaron and his children feature very, very prominently, right? Aaron, the high priest, and his descendants take center stage in this genealogy. Levi is an important son in the genealogy because he's the priestly line. From Aaron down to Phineas is mentioned in this genealogy. Some of the names in the genealogy related to Aaron that will make a later appearance in the story of Exodus and even a little bit later in the Torah are, for instance, Korah, mentioned even in the New Testament. He was actually Aaron's cousin, and he leads the rebellion against Moses a little bit later on. Then we have Nadab and Abihu, who are Aaron's older sons, and they are consumed by fire from God in the tabernacle. And their cousins, Mishael and Elzaphan, will have to carry their bodies out. I just want to mention this because it doesn't seem very coincidental that Moses' sons and Aaron's sons are getting attacked by God, one by fire and the one in the middle of the night. That's a scary business, if you know what I mean. You wouldn't want to be the son of a priest in that time. Then there's also Ithamar, and the son of Aaron, who will eventually be in charge of the construction of the tabernacle in chapter 38, which we'll come to. Then, of course, we have Phinehas, the son of Aaron, that has his own story in Numbers. Now, his story is famous for this, that when Zimri, an Israelite, took a Midianite woman into his tent, the exact same thing that Moses did, by the way, Phinehas grabs a spear. He goes into the tent and he drives the spear right through both their bellies, which means they were, I guess, on top of each other. Like, okay, they were busy with a funky monkey in there. And he kills them both. He drives a spear right through their bellies. It's hectic, guys. Now, at that stage of the story in Numbers, of course, the Midianites are an evil bunch, and they lead the Israelites astray with their god Baal Peor. So they're the bad guys. And so Phinehas, the son of Aaron, is the champion of Israel by killing Zimri, who takes in a Midianite woman. And then God gets so angry in this story that he kills 24,000 people with the plague. Yo, okay. Because one oak had the funky monkey. It's hectic, guys. It's not a great Bible story for kids, that's for sure. Let's get back to the list of names. So the list of names are recorded kind of into the future. It highlights Aaron as the priestly line. It may even function, as we said earlier, as the credentials of Aaron for becoming the high priest in the first place. Verse 26 and 27 makes the reason for the genealogy's insertion quite clear. Let me read it for you. It is the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, "Bring the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, company by company." It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. The same Moses and Aaron. The writer is establishing the pedigree of Moses and Aaron, with whom God spoke, and who then also spoke for God. But now the real action is about to begin. The second audience with Pharaoh, right? So everybody's upset now because all the slaves have to work harder. Moses and Aaron have to go back and do the same thing again, guys. It must have taken real guts. Anyway, they stick to the plan. Now, God will keep on hardening Pharaoh's heart. So it seems that God can kind of bring Pharaoh and Egypt to a place where their crime will fit the punishment, or where the punishment would fit the crime. Of course, their crime seems to be more than just the enslaving of the Israelites, but also the killing of the Israelite boys, the young boys, the infants that they threw into the Nile to drown. The infanticide that Moses himself, according to the story, escaped. So this type of crime needs to get some type of punishment. And the 10 plagues, and finally the annihilation of the Egyptian armies in the Red Sea, then seems to be the culmination of the punishment of the Egyptians for what they had done. And for this reason, as the story is being written, Pharaoh can't back out and just let the Israelites go, because then he's never going to get his due punishment. And so the writer tells us that God keeps on hardening the heart of Pharaoh. Even if he wants to let them go, he doesn't. And so God can pile upon him some more miseries, which is such a curious. I've just, all my life, I've just accepted this as this is how God works. Here we go. He does things like this. If he feels he hasn't punished you enough, he will change. He will override your will to make you do wicked things until he's punished you enough. Oh, guys, I'm sorry. I just can't take that seriously anymore. I can no longer read that and say, oh, that's exactly how God is. I really think we're dealing with the interpretation of an ancient Israelite, of what he thought God was and how he thought God worked. I can't take this anymore as this is how God works. This is how he works. He is today forever the same, and he still works the same way. I just don't buy that. Psalm 78 verse 50, for instance, which is a reading of this whole event, says like this when he speaks about how God was punishing Pharaoh and the plagues and all of that, 78 verse 50 says, he made a way for his anger. Okay, right. So there was anger and it needed to come out. And this was the way in which he was going to create a way for his anger to come out. It's rather concerning, but I think we're dealing with an old Israelite view of what God was, and not, we should, what the point I'm trying to make is we shouldn't today look at this and say, yep, that's God, that's how God works. I don't think so. Right. So anyway, in the second meeting, Aaron throws down his staff on the ground. Now, I don't know if you remember, but Moses was supposed to do this, but okay, Aaron does it. It's great. He creates these two snakes, or is it two snakes? No, one snake, obviously, from the staff. And interestingly enough, the Egyptians can do the same thing. Okay. They make snakes from their staffs. Well, it's a magic show. But God's magic is just a little bit better than theirs, and the snake of Aaron eats the staff, or the snakes, the staff snakes, the snake staffs of the Egyptian magicians. Pharaoh doesn't get the point because he stays stubborn. He doesn't care that Aaron's snake is hungrier than the other snakes. But there's a clear point being made here by the writer. Snakes are a symbol of power in Egyptian mythology. The Pharaoh wore a cobra. Pharaoh is doomed, and the Egyptians are doomed because God's coming for them and he's going to eat them alive. That's basically the point that seems to be made by the writer in this little magic show, if you want to call it that. Moses and Aaron doesn't lose hope, as of course Pharaoh says, no, I won't let them go. And so we start with the plagues. The plagues are initiated by this, again, a stubbornness of Pharaoh saying, I won't let these guys go. Even as he just saw a magic trick that was better than his, not enough evidence for him. And he obviously becomes stunned. So now the fight is on. And here is where we introduce the plagues. Now in Exodus, it's known as, of course, the 10 plagues, and we'll list them a little bit later, and we're going to talk about them quite a bit because they are very important to the story. But let's just speak a little bit about what the plagues might represent to the writer or the reader of an ancient world. It seems like the plagues are a demonstration that Yahweh, the God of creation, has his hands on creation. He's hands on, like he literally shows up, not literally, sorry, but he shows up on Egyptian land and starts affecting their produce, their natural resources, their livestock. Like he's right there and he has the power to make these things malfunction. Eventually, he also has the power of life and death in his hands, and the power of the great Nile, which is something which basically was worshipped by the Egyptians. He's in control of that as well. And the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, or whatever it is, we'll talk about that. He's got power over that as well. And he's even got power over death. He can make people die while sleeping. It's a demonstration. The plagues and the final annihilation of the Egyptian armies in the Red Sea seems to be a writing by the editors, or the writing of this portion seems to be a declaration that the God Yahweh has everything in his hand, right? He is more powerful than anybody else, right? So the plagues are on the forefront in general discussions and debates, and you can go watch some of these debates. I would encourage you to find some debates online between, please, just for heaven's sake, find reputable scholars, not armchair theologians like me. Find reputable scholars when you're watching debates on these issues. So at the forefront of the issue of the plagues are always in these discussions. Did they actually happen? Okay, let's take the first one. Did the Nile actually turn into blood? Because that's what it says. Nile turns into blood. Not red substance, red water, red algae, red food coloring, blood. B-L-O-O-D. red blood. Did this actually happen? Or are we dealing with fiction, right? Those are the two extremes. This actually did happen. There was blood. You could scoop it out and it tasted like blood. It smelled like blood. And if you could test it with a medical device, a modern medical device, it would test to be blood. Or this is pure fiction. It never happened. It's just a story. It's just a metaphor. It's myth, right? So those are the two extremes. And hopefully, I'm hoping that you, if you've been listening long enough, that you're at a place where you can at least hold ideas in suspension while not subscribing to either of these ideas or any of these ideas fully, right? You need to be able to not to get offended when someone says, were the plagues fiction? Oh, I'm so offended now, I can't think anymore. No. We need to learn how to hold in suspension these ideas without describing fully to any one of them so that we can evaluate them and think about them, right? Okay, so the issue, unfortunately, is very complicated. Unless you're a fundamentalist type Christian who just takes the Bible literally, the issue is complicated. Because it seems to be obvious that we can't just do that. But okay, let's get into it a little bit. It's a little bit more complicated than we would like it to be. The Exodus story, we've seen and we've mentioned earlier that it must have some historical roots, some historical memory that was transferred and then later embellished. And this is what, at least the writer of this book is pretty convinced, and I've researched this quite a lot, and it seems to be very, very, very accepted idea that Exodus has an historical root, but it's written in a language, or it puts on a jacket that is not necessarily historically true. Another way to say this is, although it has an historical root, the author clothes the presentation of the distant historical memory in a type of a mythical language, right? We'll explain that a little bit later. We did previously speak about the idea of mythicized history, which is the idea of exactly this. This is the term that we can use. There's a historical kernel, historical memory that is clothed in language of a greater reality, which that's what I guess technically is called myth. It's a greater reality, or it's a historical memory that's being rewritten in the language of a greater reality. Of course, that's not all myths, but it seems, at least for the term mythicized history, that's what we're dealing with. Now, just so you remember, there's a difference between mythicized history and historical myth. The one that never happened, and so we pretend like it did. The other one, the one we're dealing with, is we believe there was a historical root, but the language in which it is written obviously seems mythical to us. All right, let's talk about that, because this is a very important point. It would be possible, and I want to acknowledge that it would be possible in the abstract for God to turn water into blood. I mean, the creator of the universe, I guess he could do that if he wanted to. He could send hordes of pests if he wanted to. But the reality is, just because we can imagine that happening, or we could consider that it is possible, it doesn't mean that it actually did happen in this very story. So the question is not so much, can God do extraordinary things? No, of course he can. But whether the story has a particular historical ring to it. Now, answering such a question is always going to be highly subjective, of course, but it will mean that we need to pay careful attention to the account and look at the actual details of how the story is being told. And it's in those details, it seems that the details themselves orient the plagues from the history spectrum to the more mythicized history of the interpretive spectrum. In other words, what I mean by that is evidence of the actual text of Exodus seems to indicate that we are not dealing with pure historical fact, water that became actual blood, but we are rather dealing with some form of history that's been rewritten, understood, transferred orally, and finally written down in language which basically is not literally true. All right. So here are some of the important facts or the important ideas about the plagues that we seem to find within the text. That seems to indicate that we're dealing more with mythicized history than actual literal event history. Okay, so number one, the first thing that alerts us and makes us pause, and you can go research this for yourself, is we have three different accounts of the plagues in the Old Testament. Right? The first, or the one, is found in Exodus. That's the one we're dealing with. And then there's one in Psalm 78, which I encourage you to go read. And then also Psalm 105. These are different writers, different editors at least, writing down versions of what is remembered about the Exodus account. They're not the same. They don't say exactly the same thing. The Psalm versions seem to be way more poetic. In fact, Psalm 78 starts with, "Let me give you the parable, the dark sayings of ancient times." That's how Psalm 78 starts. So we could expect Psalm 78 to be a way more poetic rendition, and possibly true also for Psalm 105. Now, are these stories exactly the same? Oh, of course they're not going to be exactly the same. They are different versions. Oh, sure, okay. But what happens when we realize they don't have the same number of plagues in them? Or that the plagues are in different order? Right? Then we start realizing we're actually dealing with different traditions, different versions of the story. So, for instance, when we compare these three versions of the plagues, only plagues 2, 4, 7, 8, and 10 are actually found in all three stories and in the same order. Plagues 3, 5, 6, and 9, they are missing in Psalm 78, and 3 and 6 are missing in Psalm 105. There are also some minor differences. For instance, Psalm 78 does not say that the Nile turned to blood. Rather important piece of information missing. And also, Psalm 78 mentions thunderbolts with the hail. Okay. Psalm 78 goes on to include caterpillars with the locusts, and also note the difference in which divine agent is responsible for the 10 plagues. So I think this is referring to Psalm 78. It says evil angels that caused the death of the firstborns, where I think in the Exodus account, it's God himself. All right, so different versions, different information, different plagues, different order of plagues, different understanding of how these first ones, how the firstborns were killed. So this gives us just a little bit of pause. We need to think about, what does that mean for us, that we have different versions of the same story? Well, that could mean that that two of these stories, if let's say one is historically accurate, then the other two can't be, right? Now, what happens if none of them are actually historically accurate, but all of them are versions of mythicized history? And I think that's kind of how it is understood by scholars. Some scholars believe that actually the Psalm accounts are older. Psalm's accounts of the plagues are actually older than the Exodus account, right? Because the stories are more fluid, there seems to be less repetition in them, and it seems like it could be possible that Exodus writer actually just rounds it off to a nice 10. Now, 10 is an important number for the Israelites. It means law, but it symbolizes God's complete judgment. That's quite possible, and if it is true, it should affect where we place the story on the mythicized history spectrum. But on the other end, we could also assume, for instance, that Psalms is playing fast and loose with an older Exodus account. Either way, the three versions of the story should at least raise a question of the historical details of what we're dealing with. Now, unfortunately, for those who are fundamentalist Christians who believe that every literal word of the Bible is true, this is a real problem, because if that were so, the three accounts should not be word for word, but their details should be the same, and we just don't have that. And there are countless examples of this in the Bible. And so it forces us, even some of the most fundamentalist Christians, it forces them to understand that some of this is poetry and some of this is figurative. The question then becomes, how much of it is figurative? How big is the historical kernel, and how big is the mythicized version, or the poetic version, or the metaphorical version? And that's a hard question to answer, and it's no longer simple. And unfortunately, things are just not as simple as we want them to be, especially when we're dealing with ancient texts from an ancient civilization who are vastly different to ours. Things get complicated, and that's just how it is. And not being willing to deal with those nuanced differences, it just seems to be a neglect of our responsibility, especially if we call ourselves Christians that take the scriptures seriously. All right, so that's the first one. 3 different versions, different information, etc., etc. The second thing, and I don't want to go too much over my time here today. Maybe I need to cut this in half. I think I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to end here today because I want to go the next evidence that we find inside of the Exodus account itself is we find that the plagues are written in a literary pattern, a very, I would say, highly structured literary pattern, which is it's another reason why it brings into question whether it is speaking about historical things or not. Because when you read a poem that's been highly structured, it rhymes beautifully, so many stanzas, so many lines per stanza, you immediately know that you're dealing with poetry. And you most possibly also know that there's something like poetic license you would have learned about in school, that people who write down poetry are taking that license. So they venture into the metaphorical all the time. They venture into that non-literal version of the story. So when we see highly structured literary patterns, that's the first thing we start thinking about. Well, whoa, hold on. Is this a poem? Or is this just a prose narrative? Or is this a combination of both? But anyway, the point is that the text itself tells us we're not dealing with a historical narrative here. There's something bigger at play. It's being written in the language of something larger. With that, I'll leave you today, and we'll continue this next time. Thank you so much for being with me. Have an awesome Sunday. Oh, just by the way, next Sunday, I'm doing my second bicycle race. I'm doing the Amashova here in South Africa, and so there won't be a live stream next Sunday morning. I'll be on the road, ears pinned back, quads burning. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers.